All right. Hi, everybody. Sorry it's a little bit later for this to be uploaded, but I hope that completing the topic paper has gone well for you. I'll have grades on that up by Friday and feedback on how you might pursue that for your argumentative essay. In addition to that, please remember that the midterm is coming up for this Friday, so please make sure that you're taking the time to go through notes on the chapters that we've gone over so far in order to prepare best for the midterm. So for this week, we're going to talk about values. So we talked about evidence before, and values are other sets of arguments that you can think about as being particularly important. So thinking back, we've talked about claims of fact, whether or not something is true about the world, claims of policy, which is an actor taking an action, and claims of value are really talking about what we should hold dear and what things that we should really think about. So stated values are ones that are very explicitly given. So you might think about something like justice, or thinking back to the Edward Snowden activity, you might think of something like privacy. Those are examples of values that are stated. So you might have a presidential candidate who says something like, "I value our freedoms." So that's a stated value. An implied value is when the value is not explicitly given, but we can surmise that that is a particularly important thing to do. So for instance, somebody might pass along a donation box to you and encourage you to donate. They don't necessarily say you should value or, something like charity is important, but the sort of context of that is that you should contribute to charity and value charity. A positive value is a value that you should hold, that you believe is a good thing. So again, something like equality or justice is seen potentially as a positive value. We should hold this value and we should do this value. An example of a negative value would be something like trickery or being dishonest, where those are things that are seen as us not valuing, or we see those as things we should value negatively. So when you think about value as a term, it is putting a certain sort of charge or significance. We think this thing matters, and we think this thing does something for someone. Therefore, it has a value, almost like a number, right? Or a monetary value. A monetary value assesses the worth of something. So similarly, we assess worth by using values in argumentation. So a terminal value is a value that's sort of the end goal. So if we say something like quality of life, or life is the terminal value, that's the thing that we value over all else. Meanwhile, an instrumental value is ultimately serving the terminal value. So you could say that something like access to housing or income stability is an instrumental value to quality of life. So you can connect those things together in that way. Some values are really abstract. So if you think about an abstract value, right, something like liberty or something like equality is something that we think about is very kind of general, but a much more kind of concrete value might get into the specifics. Like, I value having a roof over my head, right? That's a lot more concrete, could be literally concrete, but it's a much better way that you can think about sort of paring down the value. But both of those things are important, right? Because sometimes you want to make broader claims about what values we should have, and sometimes you want to talk more immediately about the specific values that you need at a given point in time. In addition to that, you would have what you might consider to be a value system. A value system is ultimately kind of what is telling you the ways that you should sort of understand and put these values together. So for example, if you think about different societies, they might have different value systems. So for instance, in a society that's really about collaboration and working together, you might see that that type of value system really prioritizes and focuses on those values. For instance, in countries like Japan, there's much higher population, so things like politeness and courtesy to other people is sort of placed in the value system highly. And that fits really well with this idea of a value hierarchy. So a value hierarchy suggests that certain values are more important than other values. For example, in the United States, the value of freedom is often one that people put pretty high. When compared to other countries, that might not be as important or as prioritized of a value. When you think of hierarchy, think of a list, right? Most important going down to less and less important. And that's a way of thinking about values in that area. Additionally, you have ethics, right? And ethics are very much, you might think about what's right and wrong, but ethics are what we should do, what we should be like. So to go to somebody like Aristotle, right? Aristotle thought that our kind of value and in many ways how we should be is this sort of virtue that's between two vices, right? So we could either be slovenly or obsessive, but right there in the middle is being neat. So that plays into ethics and the idea that you should or should not do something in order to maintain an ideal balance of how a value system tells you to believe yourself to be as a person. You can see that values change over time. You might say that that happens very frequently with politicians, right? But the idea that the values or beliefs somebody might have might advance or change depending on the arguments they see. So we see that oftentimes values can change depending on context and situation. So maybe you say something like equality is super important, but then you start to see that, well, maybe that's not a great value, and you sort of shift to something like justice. That's an example of that maybe changing. You also have this idea of an attacking value, right? So when you attack a value, you're going to want to think again, as we always do, about the appropriate decision makers. Who are you trying to convince or persuade? One way that you can attack a value is to say that another value subsumes or is more important than that value. So you might say, while you indicate that something like justice is more important, we have to have quality of life before we can even have justice in the first place. Therefore, quality of life is more important as a value than justice. So that's an example of the way that you could attack a value, by really getting at an alternative value that's better. You can also suggest that the value has proven itself to not be particularly valuable. So you might say the justice system has proven that this doesn't work and this isn't effective. So those are a couple tactics that you can use in order to combat the value level. Additionally, you want to think about the decision makers and the values that they hold dear. So if you're working at a business meeting, right, and you're working with a CEO, I can assure you their value set is going to be different than working with a teacher, right? So you want to think about what is important to them and what are the particular goals that they're trying to achieve. If they value something like profitability, right, that value is going to be placed much higher than something like education that a teacher might value, right? So additionally, we talked about implied values a bit already. This idea that not all values are necessarily concretely given. Finally, we have this idea of sphere dependence on values. And this is something I touched on just a little bit earlier, but that sphere dependence plays into the idea that not every value makes sense in every single sphere, right? So in some situations, you're going to have somebody who really values something like liberty, like in the United States, but maybe in another country, things like access to stable income and pursuing something like universal basic income is something that that country values more highly. So values are highly charged. When we see a lot of those ethical and political issues surrounding a lot of issues, including abortion and gun control and so on, right? We see values playing into those. And values are really difficult because oftentimes we hold really strong values and belief systems. So thinking about why it is that particular decision makers hold the values that they do and thinking about how we can craft arguments with that in mind is a really good way to start to work through a lot of that material. So that does it for us for this week. Let me know if you have any questions on any of the content that we've covered.